In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was reaching its brutal end. For almost 6 long years, the world had been torn apart, and now, at last, the armies of the United States and her allies were closing in on the heart of Nazi Germany. The cities that had once echoed with the march of Hitler's armies now lay in ruins. Smoke rose over shattered towns, bridges hung twisted over the rivers, and millions of people, soldiers and civilians alike, waited for whatever came next. For the American soldiers who had fought their way from the beaches of Normandy, across France, through Belgium, and into Germany, there was a deep sense that the end was near, but also a lingering fear that the hardest part was still ahead. The German army was beaten, but not yet broken. The Nazis had vowed to fight to the last man, and even as Allied tanks rolled closer to Berlin, pockets of resistance fought on with desperate fury. Across the frozen plains of central Germany, young Americans who had survived the Ardennes and the Hürtgen Forest now faced one final test. They were tired, battle-hardened, and far from home, but they knew they had a job to finish. The war would not end until the Third Reich was gone, utterly and forever. By March, the Great Barrier of the Rhine River stood before them, the last natural defense protecting the heart of Germany. The Rhine was wide and cold, its bridges either destroyed or fiercely defended. Crossing it meant invading the very soil of the enemy's homeland. Most soldiers believed they would have to fight their way over, but fate had other plans. On March 7, 1945, men of the 9th Armored Division approached the town of Remagen, and there, to their astonishment, found the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. The Germans had tried to demolish it, but the charges had failed. For the Americans, it was a miracle. For the Germans, a disaster. Under a storm of enemy fire, Lieutenant Karl Timmerman and his men charged forward, sprinting across the steel span while bullets ricocheted around them. Engineers raced behind, cutting wires and tossing explosives into the river. Against all odds, they captured the bridge intact. Within hours, thousands of troops were streaming across, establishing a bridgehead on the eastern bank. Eisenhower called it one of the greatest moments of the war. For the men who crossed that bridge, it felt like the beginning of the end. They were inside Germany now, deep in enemy territory, and the road ahead led straight to victory, though few imagined what they would see before reaching it. As the armies pushed forward, they found towns shattered by months of bombing. Civilians emerged from cellars clutching white sheets in surrender. Some were defiant, but most were simply exhausted, broken by years of war. Children stared wide-eyed at the American convoys, their faces pale and hungry. Soldiers gave them chocolate and cans of rations, small gestures of kindness in a land that had seen so much cruelty. In the city of Nuremberg, once the proud symbol of Hitler's power, the battle raged from street to street. The Nazis had staged their grand rallies there, but now the same city was little more than a graveyard of stone. The U.S. 7th Army fought through rubble-choked streets under sniper fire and hidden explosives. Every building had to be cleared by hand. It was like Stalingrad in miniature, one GI later said. Every corner could kill you. When it was finally over, American soldiers climbed onto the ruins of Hitler's grandstand and tore down the last Nazi flags. They raised the stars and stripes where once the swastika had flown. One soldier wrote home, "All those years they shouted about 1,000-year Reich, and here it is, in dust, in less than 20. But even as victory drew closer, something far darker was waiting ahead. For months, rumors had circulated about German prison camps, about people being worked, starved, and killed. Most soldiers thought they were exaggerated. Nothing could be as bad as the whispers made it sound. Then, in late April, those rumors became reality. On April 29th, troops from the 45th Infantry Division and the 42nd Infantry Division entered the gates of Dachau, just outside Munich.
What they saw there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Bodies lay piled like cordwood beside the barbed wire. Prisoners, little more than skeletons, staggered towards their liberators with tears streaming down their faces. The air was thick with the smell of death.
A war correspondent who entered with the first troops wrote that it was as if every nightmare we'd ever had come true at once. For the Americans, it was beyond anything they had imagined. They had come to fight soldiers, not to find the evidence of murder on an industrial scale. "We didn't know," one GI said quietly, years later. "We just didn't know." Some soldiers broke down crying, others prayed. A few became so angry that discipline nearly broke. Guards were shot on sight. It was chaos, confusion, and grief all mixed together. General Eisenhower, after visiting another camp soon afterward, ordered everything documented. "Get it all on film," he said. "Get the people of the world to see it, because someday someone will say it never happened." For the Americans, the liberation of the camps changed everything. The war was no longer just a military mission. It was a moral one. They understood in that moment what the fight had truly been about. By late April, the end was inevitable. The Red Army was closing in on Berlin from the east, and the Western Allies were sweeping through southern Germany. On April 30, word spread like wildfire. Adolf Hitler was dead. At first, few believed it. Then the confirmation came over the radio. The dictator of Nazi Germany had taken his own life in his underground bunker. For most American soldiers, the reaction was not celebration, but quiet relief. They were exhausted beyond words. They had seen too much, lost too many friends, and witnessed horrors they could barely describe. "It's over for him," one wrote in his journal. "But not for us. Not yet." That "not yet" lasted another week. On May 7, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender at Reims, France. The next day, May 8th, became known as VE Day, Victory in Europe. Around the world, church bells rang, sirens wailed, and people danced in the streets. In London, Paris, and New York, crowds cheered until morning. But for the men still in Germany, it was a quieter kind of victory. The war was over, but the silence that followed felt heavy. The country lay in ruins, bridges down, cities flattened, millions displaced. Soldiers walked through towns where no building was left untouched. In some places, even the trees were splintered by shell fire. Many GIs found themselves reflecting more than rejoicing. They thought of the friends they had buried in foreign soil, the homes waiting for them across the ocean, and the strange, empty feeling when the gunfire stopped. One sergeant wrote to his wife, "Honey, it's over now. I guess we should be happy. But all I can think about are the boys who didn't make it. They ought to be the ones celebrating." After the surrender, the U.S. Army turned from fighting to rebuilding. The occupation of Germany began, a mission of peace after years of destruction. American soldiers who had spent months destroying bridges now found themselves repairing them. They guarded food warehouses instead of enemy bunkers, supervised elections, and tried to help a shattered nation find its footing again. For many, it was the first time they saw the German people as individuals rather than enemies. Mothers trying to feed their children, old men sweeping rubble from the streets, children playing in bomb craters. The same soldiers who had once fought their way through machine gun nests were now handing out candy bars to orphans. It was strange, one soldier remembered.
We'd spent all this time learning how to kill them. Then suddenly, we were helping them live. In towns near the concentration camps, GIs escorted civilians through the gates to see what had been done in their name. Some refused to believe it. Others fell to their knees, weeping. For the Americans, it was a grim reminder that victory carried responsibility. They had defeated an army, but the work of restoring humanity had only begun.
As the months passed, more soldiers were sent home. Trains carried them westward through France, then ships across the Atlantic. Parades greeted them in New York and Chicago. Families wept with joy on station platforms. But even amid the celebration, the veterans carried with them the weight of what they had seen. For some, it was the faces of the liberated, the hollow eyes that stared back at them through barbed wire. For others, it was the memory of a buddy lost to a sniper's bullet days before the surrender. The war had ended, but it would never truly leave them. Many kept their stories locked away for decades. Others spoke only in fragments, a sentence here, a photograph there. But together they formed the living memory of a generation that had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. They had gone to Europe as young men, farmers, students, factory workers, and returned as witnesses to history. They had seen the very worst of mankind, and yet they had also shown its best: courage, compassion, and the refusal to surrender, even when the cost was high. In the years that followed, their legacy became part of the American story. The rebuilt cities of Europe, the peace that held, the generations that grew up free. All of it owed something to the men who had crossed the Rhine, who had fought in Nuremberg, who had opened the gates of Dachau. When historians speak of the fall of Nazi Germany, they often mention the generals and the grand strategy. But for the soldiers who lived it, the story was simpler and more human. It was the sound of boots in the mud, the crack of a rifle in a ruined street, the cry of a child being lifted from the rubble. It was the long, lonely march home. And for those who remember them, the men of the 1945 campaign, it's important to know that their victory was not just a military triumph, it was a moral one. They proved that decency could prevail over cruelty, that courage could outlast fear, and that even in the darkest of times, ordinary people could rise to extraordinary heights. In the years that followed, their legacy became part of our shared heritage. They were the men who saw the world at its worst and helped rebuild it for the better. When they closed their eyes for the last time, they left behind a legacy that will never fade, the legacy of a generation that faced evil head-on, and in doing so, saved the soul of humanity. In the quiet years after the war, many of them never spoke of their experiences again, but when they did, it was often with humility. They didn't call themselves heroes. They said they had simply done their duty, and maybe that's what made them heroes after all. The fall of Nazi Germany was more than the end of a war. It was the triumph of light over darkness, of compassion over hate. And for the American soldiers who saw it happen, who walked through the ruins, who reached out a hand to those who had suffered, it was a moment that defined their lives forever. The guns finally fell silent, and in the stillness that followed, those men looked around at the world they had saved. The smoke drifted away, the flags were raised, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang over a land that was finally free.